Modular documentation, as I see it, is an add-on to single source publishing. But what really is modular documentation? Modular documentation is a whole methodology and best practice that looks at splitting content into smaller chunks so that you can manage and reuse them better and across any document deliverable and output in different formats. Commonly, when we think of documentation, we have in mind the traditional sort of linear approach to how content is written. The flaw with this method is that if you develop content in a linear way, you are effectively creating unnecessary dependencies across your content, and without knowing the context of the content, it's very challenging for your users to make sense of it. In other words, the content within linear documents suffers from a reusability issue. With modular documentation, we can overcome that problem altogether. Consider the following scenario. Say originally we have a linear deliverable that documents a few definitions, procedures for doing something, and tables. However, the way this stuff has been documented follows not only a linear approach, but is written in such a way that it is completely context dependent, and also with lots of dependencies existing across each section of content. If we achieve to find a way to define and structure our content into specific types that are less dependent on context and other bits of content, then we have what's known as structured content. And if we now keep and manage these individual bits of content separately as individual files and make them as context independent as possible, we not only have structured content, but we also have modular content. And that's really the essence of modular documentation. You create standalone chunks of content that are as far as possible context independent, and that you can reuse across several kinds of deliverables by grouping them in the order you want. In modular documentation jargon, one of these chunks of content is known as a topic, which is basically a discrete piece of content dealing with a specific subject and that's still meaningful when viewed as a standalone material. For example, we could develop a product sheet that uses a couple of definitions and tables. We could have a user manual that reuses a few concepts and lists a few procedures. We could have a training document that uses another bunch of concepts, and in a specific order that's just relevant to that deliverable, and so on and so forth. So, as you can see, with modularization, you gain reusability, and couple that with a good implementation approach, you'll get single source content that's structured and that makes the task of authoring documents much more streamlined. Some other benefits of modular documentation and the corresponding enabling solutions are things like better workflows, where you gain more collaborative document development, improved feedback mechanisms, a wealth of publishing capability, improved user experience, etc. The transition from linear documentation to modular documentation is not a change that happens overnight. Simply rolling out a vendor system for modular documentation, like say a database solution, doesn't magically transform things from one day to another. If you don't know what DITA is, DITA stands for Darwin Information Typing Architecture, which is an XML-based architecture for creating, managing, and publishing content. And it is the standard as far as modular documentation systems goes. So anyway, what you should bear in mind is the fact that adopting modular documentation is a paradigm shift that requires a change in philosophy. Modular documentation approaches like DITA work really well, especially for technology and engineering companies operating in sectors like automotive, aerospace, and software, but it is by no means limited to these industries.